Three words: don't give up.
What is it about this story that grabs me from the beginning? What makes it different from the other things that I've read today?
Some of my favorite op-eds are written by teenagers and by students. Welcome to the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards Podcast. I'm your host, Avery Silverberg, representing the rest of the team here at the Alliance for Young Artists and Writers. I've had the honor recently of sitting down with some of our ridiculously talented alumni and getting to the root of the questions that each of us want to know. How did you get to where you are today? Is an English degree really worth it? Do you need a literary agent to submit to publishers? And what does the publishing process actually look like? Well, today's episode is a must listen for all of those future publishing pros out there. If you've ever wondered at all how books make it from an idea to the bookshelf or what it takes to dive into the industry, you are in the right place today. Whether you're dreaming of writing the next bestseller or just curious about where your love of storytelling can take you, this episode has something for you. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first conversation today is with Marc Brown, best known for creating the Arthur books and television series. Before he created the franchise so many of us love and have grown up with, Marc was a teen himself whose art teacher entered a piece of his into the awards. In 1963, he won a gold key, and it was then that he realized he could make a career doing what he loved. There is so much we can learn from Marc, but I think my favorite part of this interview is really just the way that Marc talks about determination. He really harps on how it's not the talented ones in the class who succeed, but the ones who never give up. It's such an inspiring conversation, and I can't wait for you to listen to it. Enjoy. Hello, Marc. Welcome to the Scholastic Awards Podcast. So excited to have you here today.
Great to be here.
So I'd love to just go ahead and start at the beginning. Would you just tell us a little bit about what you won your Scholastic Award for and how it impacted your career and your journey as a writer?
It was for a woodcut that I hand colored, and it was called Carnival Bride. First woodcut I'd ever done. And it takes me right back to my high school art class. And one of the most wonderful teachers ever to walk the earth, Nancy Bryan, she took me aside my first couple of classes and said, "Marc, I don't think there's much I can help you with, but I'm going to give you all the materials that you want, and I'm going to give you my office, and you can work there." And it terrified me and excited me at the same time because it was just the beginning of high school, and I was majoring in art. And here I was on my own. So that's where we start with Nancy Bryan, but the story goes on.
Please tell us more. So yeah, what did it feel like when you won that award as a teen? How did that help with your
Oh my
confidence?
gosh. Well, I was living in Erie, Pennsylvania, and we weren't fortunate enough to have the Scholastic Art Awards in Erie. So every year, our art class would get in a large bus and go to Pittsburgh. And in Kaufman's department store, there was a wonderful exhibit of all of these talented kids from all over the state. And I mean, I would just look at them and wonder, how can they have so much talent?
Mhm.
It just was mind-boggling and inspiring at the same time.
Wow, no, I'm so sure. And so when you won that award, did that kind of inspire you, like the trajectory for what you wanted to
It
do?
was, I've heard other people who've won these awards talk about the validation
Right.
that it instantly gives you, that there is this force out in the world that it knows a lot more than you do, and somehow they think there's something there, and they give you this mention of honor, which is just, you know, so important. And here I am in Erie, Pennsylvania, this teenager that is trying to figure out art on my own. And
Absolutely.
And to have that award it meant all the world to me.
So, after that, I'm so curious to know, where did the idea for Arthur come from? Did that come from your own life? What's the origin story there?
I never thought of being a picture book illustrator, but when I was in high school, I had a baby sister who was born, and all she did was cry and poop. And I couldn't stop the pooping, but I could stop the crying by reading picture books to her.
Mm,
And one of her favorite books was Where the Wild Things Are. Oh, it's a magical book because he tells so much of the story through his pictures.
absolutely.
And it's the perfect example of what a picture book should be. It's this delicate scales where you have your words on one side and your pictures on the other, and you want to balance that scales. And you don't want to use too many words to do what the pictures are
Right.
doing. And so as I was reading this book to her over and over and over again, I really saw what Sendak was doing and how magical it was. And it planted something in my brain that I came back to years later.
Uh-huh. And so how did you decide on Arthur being an aardvark? That's a question that we need to know.
All the good animals were taken.
Is that
It
true? Is that how you came up with it?
was like aardvarks are very underserved in the world of children's literature.
I completely agree.
So, and I was trying to entertain my young son with a bedtime story, and that's where Arthur was born.
So, did you always know you wanted to create stories for children specifically, or was there ever a moment where you thought maybe otherwise, or was it primarily that was your passion?
Having younger sisters, I was kind of aware of books and how important they were in their lives. And I think that's kind of where it started. And I still had younger sisters when I went off to art school, and there was this big drawing competition that the Art Institute had every year for sophomore students, and everyone kept saying, "Oh, you're gonna win! You're gonna win!" And I, I didn't know that that was going to happen, but I was really confident in the portfolio that I put into consideration. And I didn't win. And my drawing teacher took me aside afterward and said, Mark, you probably would have won this if you hadn't put in those children's illustrations. Back then, um, children's book illustration was a low rung on the ladder.
Right.
And how high we've climbed since then. I mean, to be working in this industry with so many talented people, it's really exciting what we're doing for kids visually. So, I had to think about that seriously. What's wrong with children's books? What
Yeah. So, how did
and
you come past that constructive criticism? How did you know that that was something you wanted to listen to your own voice moving forward and not take that in? How did you get past that?
Well, I think it was a matter of survival and learning from it. When I graduated from art school, I moved to Boston, and the way that I supported myself was illustrating textbooks for
Mhm.
kids. And I learned a lot about sexual stereotyping. At the time, it was very, very important for kids. And I learned a lot from illustrating these textbooks. And I was lucky enough to have an editor who said, Mark, you should talk to Emily McLeod at the Atlantic Monthly Press because she fosters young talents and helps them find their way. So I took her that bedtime story about Arthur, and she read it very politely. And she said, Well, Mark, it needs a lot of work.
what every artist
So,
wants to hear.
so that began my career in children's books. And she
Okay.
was right. I was using a paragraph when I could have used one well-crafted sentence. So I learned a lot in that first book, Arthur's Nose. And now when I look at it, I feel I cringe because it's like going to a party in your underwear. I was
Oh,
not.
that's hilarious. Wow. Okay, well, I think that so many creators will feel comfortable or feel better hearing that from you, that even you look back on your first work and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe that was me at the beginning. So for every young artist listening, just know that you are not alone in that feeling. Speaking of young artists, a lot of our listeners are hoping to become authors, illustrators themselves. Do you have any advice for, I know, and we
Go,
need them. We
kids,
need these
go.
young voices more than ever. So could you please, any words of wisdom you have when it comes to the publishing process, the creative process, anything like that?
3 words, don't give up. I watched so many of my colleagues when they left art school, and they were so talented, more talented than I was. And they gave up. They got safe jobs
Yes.
and took this crazy detour in their lives that, I don't know what happened to all of them, but I was really disappointed in them.
Hmm.
And you have to have that desire to succeed
Yeah.
and picture yourself as successful.
Hmm.
And, that will help you. And you're going to get
Okay.
a lot of, knocks along the way. But if you stay the course, you will be rewarded.
Absolutely. That's so important. I mean, I've always heard that what separates an author from a writer is the one who keeps pursuing, who keeps going, which, can be a lot easier said than done. Do you have,
You're making me think of something,
okay,
another little morsel of encouragement for our
please.
audience. So one of the first books I illustrated was I found them in the Yellow Pages. And I thought of that the other day. We don't have Yellow Pages anymore. I mean, we just Google things. And but Norma Farber, this very talented woman, had written this great picture book at the time, and I got the opportunity to illustrate it. And I got to know her because she was very prolific as an author. And she said to me, Mark, please don't ever get discouraged. I had a book that was rejected, I think it was 22 times. And the 23rd editor who read that manuscript and published it was rewarded with a National Book Award. And you can't take one rejection as the end of the road. And, please think of Norma Farber and thank her for her wisdom and, great advice to just keep going.
Well, as a writer myself who has faced a lot of rejection so far, I take that to heart, and I know so many of our listeners will as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Moving on to the Arthur TV show, which was so influential to so many of us. How did that happen? How did you move on from the books to the TV series? And what was it like for you to see your work come to life? That must have been amazing.
Well, I never imagined working in television. The local PBS affiliate in Boston, WGBH, who they produce, I guess, about 30% of the content on PBS. They called me up one day and they asked me if they could talk to me about putting Arthur on television. And honestly, my first reaction was, I don't think so.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of what kids were seeing on television
Hmm.
then. This
Hmm.
was back in 1994 or 5.
Hmm.
And, so much of it was gratuitous violence and just this energy, and you couldn't like take in a story. It was movement and chaos. And I thought kids deserved better, but I didn't think of myself as the person who could do that. Um, so we set up a meeting, and I learned that their goal with Arthur was to use animation and television, two very seductive forces at the time in kids' lives, to make kids want to read and
Mm.
go to the library. And, I had sold like 5,000, no, how many books? 5 million Arthur books at that point. And within a year or so after Arthur hit television, it went up to 50 million.
Wow.
And the power of the media. And now I'm marveled. I'm working on other animated series for kids and just had one start with HBO Max called Hop for preschoolers. I was inspired by a really good friend, Fred Rogers, who was so good working with preschoolers, and I always wanted to work with that age level, and so that's what I'm working on now. And developing another series that kind of celebrates education in a really goofy, funny way. And working on a book that is in the Wayback Time Machine. It takes place in 1830.
Oh, okay.
It's about a little boy who loves to draw, who meets an itinerant folk painter. Back in those days before cell phones and artists would visit towns and put an ad in the local paper, and people would come to the local hotel where he or she was staying and have their portraits painted for maybe $5 or $6 if you wanted the whole body. And there was one artist back then who has fascinated me for a long time. His name is John Brewster Jr. He was deaf and mute, and yet he navigated society very successfully with a little chalkboard and mime, and made his way and painted these beautiful portraits of adults and children. And I saw an exhibit of his work years ago, and it just stayed with me. So I'm working on that right now, and I'm really excited because it allows me to do something different.
Yeah.
And I think of myself as an illustrator, not an author.
Oh, okay.
And
Tell me more about that. Well, why is that?
uh, it's just my makeup. I like to tell stories with pictures,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and I love working with people who do all the heavy lifting of writing the story.
Right.
Because I don't like that. It's hard.
It is hard. Not like drawing is
You
any
know.
easier. I don't think so, but that makes so much sense. So in terms of speaking to children, I know you tell stories through your illustrations, which is so important for kids in itself. But what's the secret to kind of understanding the way that kids think? How do you really like get inside their brain and tell a story that holds their attention?
You don't grow up. I'm a 6-year-old. I know. Please don't tell anyone. I think so many of successful people who work in children's books are still in touch with their childhood in a good way.
Yeah.
And some aren't.
Hmm.
And some don't like children, which really shocks me.
Hmm.
But, they're out there and they're producing wonderful children's books. Um, So I mean, there was a teacher at an elementary school that I visited years ago, and she had this project she was doing with her class. She said, "Everyone, I want you to think of yourself as a bumper sticker. What would it say?" And I thought, "Oh, that is a fun idea." And immediately my bumper sticker said, "I like all kids and some adults."
I love that and resonate with that completely. I mean, I wanted to come into this industry because when I was a teen, I remember thinking, nobody understands the way I think, like so many teens do. And I promised myself, I said that I'm going to remember how this feels, and I'm not going to let anybody tell me not to remember it. So I think it's so
Excellent.
valuable to stay in touch with your inner teen, your inner child, so you can
Yeah,
hold on to that. So that is
absolutely.
excellent
Yeah, don't
advice.
lose that or you're lost.
Yes, absolutely. So, do you have any tips of encouragement for teens who are hesitant about entering the awards? For so many teens, this is their very first time entering their work at all. Maybe they haven't shown their work to a single human. How do you get past that?
Oh, I mean, don't even think about it. Do it. It will open doors for you. And don't give up. if it
Mhm.
doesn't happen the first time. Just keep at it. The first time I entered, I didn't win anything in junior high school. And, I had friends who proudly were having pictures taken of them holding their work, and I was so envious.
Mhm.
But, I think because I never thought of myself as the best in
Right.
any category, I worked harder. It was a gift to me in many ways to
Mhm.
work harder to get there. And
Mhm.
uh, you know, uh, don't give up.
Mhm.
Keep trying because it's a wonderful like fraternity, sorority to belong to.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't
Yes,
agree more. Were there any characters that you took specifically from your own life, or did it all come from your imagination?
they're all from my own life, and I expect to hear from their attorneys every day. I live in fear.
That
No,
is hilarious.
it was my third grade class. I wish I had the picture I could share with you right now. Miss Kingston's third grade class. There was Buster. There's the brain. There's Prunella. There's Sue Ellen. They're all there. And I have this uncanny memory. I mean, I can see the classroom. I could paint every square inch of it. I can smell Miss Kingston making popcorn in the back of the room. I can remember Suzanne Lang, who sat next to me and became Prunella, saying to me, well, whispering, Mark, do you know all the answers to the math problems are in the back of the book? And, I was in disbelief. So I had to check it out. And just as I did, Miss Kingston walked by my desk and I was busted. And then I had to go to Mr. Haney's office, our principal, who became Arthur's principal as well.
Wow.
So it goes on, and my sisters became DW, a triple
Wow.
force.
That is so great because I think that's such a relatable experience for a lot of creatives. I mean, they say write what you know, which is, clearly you wrote what you knew as a kid.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
the question I get asked most often from kids where to
huh,
get your ideas.
right.
And they're around us every single day. We just have to keep our eyes and our ears open. And there's a story idea there.
Absolutely. So have you had any people along the way say, "Hey, I know that you based that character off of me"?
Yeah, a few of them know.
Yeah, of course, of course. But the people in your life know that any artist is going to take inspiration, like you
It's
said.
dangerous. Never hang around with us. Never.
I agree. We're dangerous people. Welcome to Hot Seat. This is the segment where we ask our guests a speed round of questions about life, creativity, and everything in between. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Amazing. Would you rather take a trip to the bookstore or a trip to the museum?
Museum,
Do you enjoy hardcovers or paperbacks?
hardcovers.
Who do you relate to more, Arthur or DW?
I am Arthur, but I want to be DW. She
Great
is the
answer.
most fun to write for and to get inside her head.
Hey, my brother would say the same thing about me, so that makes sense. Who do you
So
relate?
you're trouble, huh?
Younger sisters are. What can I say?
Tell me about it.
Which is harder to draw, a character's expression or the background of a scene?
I think it's difficult to get the expressions of the characters. That's the first thing I learned in my first book, Arthur's Nose. My editor said, Mark, forget about all your fancy techniques you learned in art school and concentrate on how the expressions of your characters. So that is really important.
Do you like to work in silence or work with background noise?
Work in silence to write, and I turn up the stereo as high as it will go when I'm doing my art.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee. More coffee, please.
I agree with you.
Please.
Do you outline your work or do you dive right in?
I have to do a dummy of the book. I have to see how it's working. I do about 30 versions of the manuscript before I start illustrating. And so I do this little dummy and I do thumbnail sketches on my final manuscript. to get me going. Once I get the dummy in place, I'm off to the races and I turn up the stereo.
Do you prefer working on funny moments or heartfelt moments?
Well, with Arthur, I was always focused on humor because I think kids learn best through humor. But with this book that I'm working on now, it's different for me because I'm working with a relationship between a father and his son and things that aren't going well for them. And so it's a lot about the emotion in this book, in this new book, and it's fun. I'm really enjoying it and trying to get it just right.
And our very last question is, do you have a place where our audience can find you, an Instagram, website, anywhere where people can go and check you out?
Marc Brown 333 on Instagram.
Amazing. There you go. Well, Marc, thank you
Come
so
and
much.
join me.
Yes.
I post all kinds of crazy things that are around me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this conversation. I know it was so inspiring. I feel inspired to keep going. So thank you so much for that.
You are an excellent interviewer.
Thank you. That means so much.
Our next guest is here to tell us about an entirely different side of the publishing industry, literary agents. Alexandra Franklin is an associate agent at Curtis Brown. But in 2010, Alexandra was a Gold Medal Portfolio Award winner and continued on to be the editor of the Best Teen Writing of 2011 anthology. Alexandra has such great career advice in this interview. Whether you're thinking about being an agent yourself, or you're a writer seeking representation, or maybe you have no idea what a literary agent does at all, that's okay, because you should get ready to take some notes and learn some pearls of publishing wisdom from Alexandra Franklin. Hi, Alexandra. Welcome to the Scholastic Awards Podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Hi, Avery. This is really, really fun. Thanks for asking me to be here.
Of course. So let's just kick it off with telling us a little bit about what you do, what your job is, and a little elevator pitch about yourself.
Yeah, I am a literary agent at Curtis Brown in New York. And I am also an agent in the dramatic rights department at Curtis Brown. So in my role as a literary agent, I look for new authors and try to sell their manuscripts to publishing houses and negotiate their contracts for them and kind of manage them throughout the course of their writing career. And as a dramatic rights agent, I work very closely with the other people in our department to sell the film and TV rights to the books that Curtis Brown represents, which is a whole different side of the industry and is also very, very interesting.
That's so interesting. So have you been representing both your entire career, or is one of them been added on later?
Yeah, I came to Curtis Brown with a background just in literary agenting. So the dramatic rights side was new to me, but I just think it's so interesting to learn the ins and outs of all the different sides of what you can do with a book and how to make sure that it reaches all the audience, as broad an audience as it possibly can.
Absolutely. I have so many questions about that, but before we move on, how about we take it back and tell us a little bit about your Scholastic Awards experience, what you won for, and how did that impact the rest of your career moving forward? Did it help you determine that you wanted to be a literary agent?
Yeah, my gosh, I really, in many ways, feel like I owe almost everything that I do now to the awards. I loved writing in high school, of course, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, if you know what I mean. It was just something that I did because I just had this impulse to do it and I loved it. But so I won in 2009 when I was a junior, I won the American Voices Award for a short story that I submitted. And then the next year when I was a senior, I won the Gold Portfolio Award, and I had submitted some short fiction and some poetry. So that was really the beginning of it for me. That was wildly exciting. And I came to New York to accept the award and met my fellow winners, and that was incredible too. And then I actually was asked to edit the Best Teen Writing anthology for the following year. And I think that was really the beginning of a lot of things for me because I realized then that I just found it terrifically interesting to read other people's writing, to evaluate it, to curate it, to figure out what works where and why that is. And
Mhm.
also I was interacting with the writers whose work we were including in the anthology. And I really loved that too, talking to people
Right.
about what they had written and what their background was and what they thought about all of it. I just loved it. I loved every aspect of it. And so then I started thinking that I want to find a job that lets me feel like this all the time.
Yep.
And that led me to publishing more broadly, and then to
Mhm.
agenting, which I think is a slightly lesser known aspect of the publishing.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people, you think first about editors, right?
Yep.
But I think agents work a little bit more in the background, but it's a really important part of the publishing ecosystem. And it's such an honor to be able to work with authors in this way. I take it really, really seriously, but it's also just a lot of fun.
Absolutely, I'm sure it is. I mean, especially that feeling of when you read a manuscript for the first time and you have that like special feeling about it. I'm sure that never gets old.
No, it never. If anything, I think it just gets more and more exciting the longer I do it. It really is
Absolutely.
like falling in love all the time, which is
Yes,
great.
absolutely. So, for those who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about what it is you actually do on a day-to-day basis? Because I completely agree with you. Agenting is not something that people outside of publishing really talk about, and especially as a teen myself who wanted to be an English major, I remember just, thinking the only thing I could do is be a teacher or like be a writer. And the fact that there's this whole other career is something that I really want more teens to be aware of and to know is an option. So could you tell us a little bit about what you do exactly?
Yeah, well, I just think it's the greatest job on earth, and I would love for more people to find it. I One thing that I really like about my job is that every day is different, and every hour is different. A lot of it just depends on what crops up, but basically, it's a lot of reading manuscripts, which is a really
Yep.
fun part of the job. There's also a lot of client management stuff. So, for
Mhm.
example, on any given day, I might be out on submission with a client's manuscript and following up on that. I might be crafting a pitch letter for another client's submission, getting it ready to go out to editors. I might have a client who is in the middle of the editorial process. Their book has
Right.
sold and they're interacting with their editor, and they might want me to take a look at their revisions or just talk about some of the proposed edits. Gosh, there's just so much that goes into it. And some of it is like, I just think all of it is interesting, but there's also a part of it that is very business based. I mean, publishing
Absolutely.
itself is business, and it is so important that we all love to read and love what we do and love interacting with clients. But there's also a side of it that is pretty cerebral. And I think that if I were in any other field, something like negotiating contracts or looking through
Mhm.
financial reports might feel a little dry to me. But because those things are so closely linked to the book business, somehow it just makes more sense to me and I find it more interesting. It's just, it all kind of works together. And so there's just something new to learn every day.
Absolutely. Yeah, something that I've always thought about with agenting is like, let's say you have a college student who's figuring out what they want to do and they know they love books, reading, writing, that's what they want to do, but they don't feel as comfortable with, contracts. What does that even mean? How was your learning experience of doing all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that most people who get into publishing are initially drawn to it because they love to read and not because they're so wild about contract negotiation. It
Mhm.
can just be a happy accident when you discover that in addition to loving books, you also find contracts very interesting. Agenting, in my experience, seems largely based on what I would kind of describe maybe as an apprenticeship model, where
Mhm.
you get an internship or you get your first job as an assistant, but you work very closely with the agent you're supporting. And ideally, you learn by watching, and then you learn by doing in a supervised capacity, and then you are ready to start doing it on your own. It really is just one of those things that I'm not sure anyone is really expecting someone to come into their very first job at an agency knowing the ins and outs of this. But the field is heavily populated with wonderful people who love talking about this kind of thing because we find it so interesting, and we love teaching it to new people too. So I would say it's not strictly necessary to know how to do any of this stuff before you start. However, I will say this. If you are interviewing for a job at an agency, you will be competing with a lot of people who are all saying that they love to read. But one thing that can set you apart if you're looking for an edge is to say, and in addition to that, I am really interested in the business side of publishing. I may not have any experience with that, but I'm very eager to learn. And that is something that not a lot of people come into it saying, often because they don't know how big a part of it that is. But
Of
I think
course.
that can really set you apart as a candidate. That would be my interview advice.
Amazing. Okay, listeners, you heard it here first. That is a great insider tip. Thank you for that. We have so many writers who are listening to the show. So, a little more writing oriented questions for you. You read so many query letters, I can't even imagine. And so, could you tell me a little bit about what is something that you're looking for in a query when you first start reading them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish that I could give you kind of a silver bullet answer. The truth is that there are a lot of things that I look for. I look for a hook. What is it about this story that grabs me from the beginning? What makes it different from the other things that I've read today? Sometimes we talk about this as a concept. What is the pitch? And that is something that I look for. I also look for just someone whose voice feels very clear. I want to know that that is your voice. And it is really difficult to know. That's a hard thing to teach. I think sometimes you just know it when you see it. But on the other hand, I see a lot of things. Every agent has a story about a manuscript that they have passed on because they just don't feel like they're connecting to the voice in some ineffable way. And then you go on to see that book sell at auction for $1 million. And so I think the thing to keep in mind is just that it is so subjective that there's no real formula.
Right.
I wish I could say, put these three things into your query letter and that'll get you an agent. The truth is it's a little bit like dating in many ways. It's kind of about finding the person who gets you and gets what you're doing
Absolutely.
and gets your voice and really sees it, because that's an agent who will be able to advocate for you passionately in the way that you want your agent to be able to do.
Oh, so true. I mean, I think there are a lot of writers out there who are just so desperate to have an agent to seek representation that they almost forget about all the components of do we work well together?
Yeah.
So what's your typical style like? Like, are you editorial before you go on submission, or what's your working relationship with your clients?
I I try to be as hands-on as the project needs. And every book is different. Some things come to me remarkably fully formed. And
Mm,
in that case, I just want to do a few read-throughs to see, is there a hitch here? Is there a hitch here? Does this character ring true? Do I believe that they would behave in this way? Tweaks, kind of. Some things have come to me, and I think the bones of it are all here. And I believe in it enough to want to put in as much work as it needs to get to a point where I feel like it has its best shot on submission. And
right.
it's a crowded market, and editors see a lot of manuscripts. And so my philosophy is sort of that I don't want to send out anything that isn't as ready as it possibly can be, because the competition is stiff, and I want to make sure
Yep.
that we are we are really in the best place that we possibly can be before editors clap eyes on it. So I do
Mhm.
tend to be fairly editorial. I like that part of it a lot. And I think that being a writer is is a compatible skill set with editing other people's work. I can kind of see why writers make the decisions that they do as I'm reading. You know, I know that there are some agents who are less editorial and hands-on,
Mhm.
some that are more. And that, to your point about working style, you know, I think you have to sort of ask yourself when you're going on submission to agents, what kind of agent do I want to work with? Do I want to work with someone who is really, really hands-on or not? And that is something that you can also ask an agent. If an agent reaches out to you and says, I love this, I want to represent this, you can say, this is my working style. What's yours? And then kind of figure out if you're compatible with each other.
Absolutely. I love that. That's awesome. So for our young writers listening, what are just some overall like tips you have, any mistakes you see in writing that young writers can always work to improve on, young writers, starting out writers, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah. Well, let me think. I mean, I think the number one piece of advice is just to read, right? If you're going to
Yeah.
be a writer, you just have to be reading a lot. And ideally, you would be reading a lot of things that have been published recently so that you're familiar with the kind of things that are out there right now. Um, but also, I think that one thing that I do see sometimes is occasionally I get the sense that a writer, and this is not limited to young writers, this is all
Right.
ages, right? But sometimes I think that authors set out to write a book and their thinking is what is going to sell based on what is on shelves right now. So they're writing toward the market, right? But by the time a book hits shelves, we
Yeah.
are looking for something new, you know, because the lead time between, you know, a book selling and a book hitting the shelves, it could be 2 or 3 years. And so
Right.
it's impossible to know what the market is going to do next. And so rather than try to approach your book in a businessy thing, like, well, you know, vampires are really hot right now, so let me write a vampire book. I would say that I would say just if you're going to write a book, just write the book you want to write and trust that that story has a home, has a place, has an audience, and it's just about finding that. Because I just think it's impossible. It's a moving target to write toward a market that changes so quickly. So I would say really just stick to the things that you want to say and that you know you can say differently than anyone else. And I think that you can't go wrong with that.
Absolutely. No, that's such good advice. Okay, so for teens submitting their work for the first time ever, the Scholastic Awards, one thing I love about the awards so much is just how confidence is built in a young writer to know,
Yeah.
oh, somebody outside of myself or my family values and sees importance in my voice and my writing. So, can you talk a little bit about like fighting that the jitters of submitting your work for the first time?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think everybody has those. I think that's totally normal. And I don't even know that I would try to fight it. I just think you have to push through it because even setting aside what feels like a huge barrier to entry by submitting your manuscript to agents and the fear of rejection is very real and I'm not sure that ever really goes away. It takes a lot of vulnerability to send your work out into the world to have even one other person read it. And that is something that I know that feeling from the other side of it, being a writer. And so I just try to really, I have so much respect for everybody who sends me their work because I think finishing a novel is a superhuman thing to do. I think no matter, I mean, whether that sells or not, the fact that you wrote it and finished it and pulled up the courage to send it to somebody, that is something that most people never do. I mean, that
Right.
deserves a lot of respect. And so I try to just approach my inbox with a real sense of just I just feel grateful when people trust me with their work. And I don't know if this is really answering your question, but I know most agents I know feel the same way. And so if it helps the jitters at all, just know that we got into this business because we love this and because we have so much respect for writers. And I couldn't do my job if people stopped writing. I rely on these authors. at least as much as they rely on me, if not more so. And so, I would just keep in mind that you are not sending your work out into a hostile world. You are sending it to someone who might also be looking for you. So I would
Mm,
just go into it with the mindset of, I'm not sending it to someone who's just gonna think I'm
nice.
stupid for sending it. You're sending it to people
Yeah.
who,
I think like writers will catastrophize and imagine a boardroom of people making fun of your words and saying, why does this person thinks they can be an author? What are they thinking?
yeah.
But
No,
such a good reminder that everyone's in this industry because we love it and we love books, and that makes all the sense in the world. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I really think in 99.9% of cases, your
yes.
work is in good hands. Even if it's a pass, no one is making fun of you for writing it or sending it.
Right. Yes, of course. As far as the businessy side of being an author, can you tell us a little bit about social media? This is kind of a hot button question for the past few years,
Yeah.
is how much should an author be on social in terms of finding representation? Is it crucial to be on social? What's your opinion?
I, that is such a good question. And I think well, so some of this depends on the kind of book that you're writing.
Fair. Yeah.
Often, if you're writing some sort of serious nonfiction where you're putting yourself forward as an authority on a certain subject, sometimes editors will say, what's their platform? Meaning, how many followers do they have on Twitter? How many followers do they have on Facebook? How much are they a known name under this topic? I think for fiction, it matters slightly less because
Mm,
really what fiction comes down to is the story great? Is it interesting? Is
right.
the voice strong? It's really the quality of the work itself. So I there are different schools of thought on this, but I often just feel as though if you have a great social media presence, if that's something you happen to naturally find really easy and fun to do, and that's a particular gift that you have, it will not hurt. It
Right.
absolutely will never hurt. But I do think if that feels like a struggle to you or it feels daunting, it is, I don't think I've ever seen that be the reason that someone didn't get a book deal,
Hmm.
particularly in fiction. And I just think that as a writer, your time is probably better spent reading,
Yeah.
honing your craft, all of that. I will say that social media can be really, really useful for writers in that it's a great way to connect with other writers. And this is a field that is really driven by community in many ways. And I'm not saying you have to network in glad hand and be insincere, but I am saying sometimes those connections form organically on social media. And so that can be something to think about. Not necessarily that that will help you get a book deal, but I just think
Yeah.
overall that's a good thing to have.
I can
So,
echo that secondhand because I actually met a lot of my in-person friends from TikTok, from the writer side of TikTok.
oh,
So
that's
I am
awesome.
living proof of that, it's almost essential to have other writers who are just like championing you on and encouraging you. And it just makes it so much more motivating. So I totally agree with that.
Definitely. The TikTok thing is really interesting too. The whole book talk question has kind of taken publishing completely by storm. I'm sure you know.
Absolutely. Yes, I know.
Game
Especially for like
changer.
YA though, I feel like YA, romance, romantasy, like I feel like there are specific genres that really are trending on Book Talk and others that aren't.
For sure. Yeah, it definitely hits with certain demographics more than others, which I guess makes sense. But it has publishing can be an industry that is somewhat slow to change, and we don't always see huge jumps and numbers and things like that based on something like social media. But TikTok really changed that. So
Yes,
that's been the source of a lot of conversations on the business end of things too. It's a lot of books have been sold
for
off
sure.
TikTok, campaigns and things like that.
Yeah, so speaking of our agents kind of ever I mean this is generalized, but looking through TikTok to see are there writers pitching ideas on TikTok?
I don't know about that so much. I'm not really on TikTok, although I probably should be, given what a big deal it is just in the industry, let alone culture at large. But the sense that I get is that the impact of TikTok has been more on the sort of marketing publicity side, the kind of word of mouth sales of, certain books or series or things like that that just really catch fire there. So I think that's been largely the impact that TikTok has had on the industry. This just sales for people just talking about these books and being able to find other people who would love this book but might not have heard of it before. I think it's entirely possible that there are agents who are looking through TikTok for people who are pitching ideas, but I'm not as sure about that. I just know that it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere really. And if it does, it has already changed our industry and the way that we talk about books and the way that publishing houses are thinking about how to market books and what platforms to take seriously. I think even just a few years ago, probably, big corporate teams at publishing houses might not have taken TikTok very seriously as a driver of our industry. And that would have been incorrect. So it's
absolutely no, and especially what you say about like the language of how you market books now, even something as simple as like tropes. Like when I was a teen, I do not think that people were talking about tropes. I don't think my friends knew what a trope was. And now all you hear, you walk through the teen section of Barnes and Noble and it's, oh my God, this is friends to lovers. This is enemies to lovers. It's so funny.
Absolutely. And books are being bought and sold on the business end of it too, with exactly those things. And I just think it's fascinating. And it's a good reminder too, that you never know the next disruptor that's going to crop up and change the way that we do things and think about things. So we're just trying to stay really agile over here. And
for sure. And this is again why you can't write to trend, because anything can change.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's it.
So we're going to move on to a fun little surprise segment, which is super easy. And it's literally like a quick answer. It's a hot seat segment. So you choose like one of the options and no wrong answers here. But before we get there, can you tell us about a book that you read recently, a client's work that made you just feel really excited that you're a part of this industry?
Yeah, I will be honest with you. Every single time I read something that my clients write, I feel excited all over again. And I think, these wouldn't be things that I represent if I didn't feel that way. But every time you're just like, this is it. This is the one. This is it. This is the one I've been looking for. And to feel that way over and over is incredible. I just sold a book this week, actually, by an author, a client of mine named Carrie Schlottman, who I don't know if you know, was actually working at the Scholastic Awards when I won. And that's how I met her. And we kept in touch. It's been almost 15 years. And I took on her novel recently and we just sold it. And I'm so excited about it. And it's coming out in 2026, I think. It's called Daytime Moon. Beautiful. But that's just another plug for the ways
I love that
words have like changed the course of my professional life and community too, right?
This is Hot Seat.
Are you ready?
I hope so.
Would you rather read a client manuscript on a screen or print it out?
Honestly, I probably would prefer to print it out, but I read a lot of manuscripts on a Kindle going back and forth on the train and things like that. So often it's on a screen, but paper is just, it's a different thing.
Would you rather have bad dialogue when you're reading or slow pacing?
Slow pacing. I'm kind of a sucker for slow pacing, unfortunately.
First person or third person?
Oh, I don't know. It just depends. Maybe third person. But I may change my mind about that in 5 minutes.
Plot twist or cliffhanger?
Plot twist.
Where is your favorite place to read? On the couch, in your bed, or at a cafe somewhere in public?
On the couch.
Caffeine or decaf?
Coffee.
Beach vacation or a city vacation?
Oh, it's not really a vacation if you're in another city, is it? Probably beach vacation.
Love triangle or enemies to lovers?
Enemies to lovers.
For bookshelf organization, color-coded or alphabetical by author?
Alphabetical.
And our last question is, where can our listeners find you?
Great question. I never remember my Twitter handle. I think that it is Alexa Franklin 08. And there's also, if there's anyone out there who is interested in sending me their work, either now or sometime in the future, my profile can be found on the Curtis Brown website, which is curtisbrown.com. And there you can find my profile with a little bit about what I'm looking for and some of my guidelines for submissions, just the format that I like to see things in, and my email address. So I'm always here. I'm always open. And if any of you do submit to me, if you could just note somewhere in that email that you listened to this conversation or that you were involved with the awards, that would be awesome. And I would love to give that special attention.
I love that. That's so nice of you to give that little shout out. So our listeners should totally take advantage of that. Well, Alexandra, thank you so much. This was so fascinating. And I can't thank you enough for such an awesome conversation.
This was so much fun. Thank you. I love talking about this stuff, and you're an awesome host. So really,
Thank you.
Our final chat today brings us to the nonfiction side of the publishing industry with journalist Emi Neitfeld. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Rumpus, Vice, and more. Emi is also a software engineer and a phenomenal source for anyone interested in pursuing both a career in the arts and sciences. She is a walking example of how it is possible to do it all, with excellent wisdom surrounding balance, writing routines, and submitting essays to magazines. Please enjoy this conversation with Emi Neitfeld. Hi, Emi. Welcome to the Scholastic Awards Podcast. So excited to chat with you today.
I'm so excited to be here, Avery.
So how about we just start off with you telling me a little bit about like an elevator pitch for what you do, what you write, and what your connection is to the Scholastic Awards.
So I'm an author and a journalist and a former software engineer. I wrote the book Acceptance about my adolescence, high school, this wild journey that included time in foster care and homelessness. And I wrote that book while working full-time at Google and then at Facebook. It came out in 2022. And ever since then, I have been reporting and writing full-time.
Amazing. Okay. And so what's your connection with the Scholastic Awards? What did you win for?
Oh, I was a Gold Key portfolio winner back in 2010.
Awesome. Okay, fantastic. So can you talk to us a little bit about just like how you got to where you are today and what that trajectory was like? What did you major in college? All that fun stuff.
When I was in high school, I loved writing. I did National Novel Writing Month every year for 4 years, where you write 50,000 words during November. I wrote so many poems in my notebooks, and I was really lucky to go to a high school that had a really strong arts program for the last 2 years. And that was just a total turning point in my life, because before that, I had been dealing with a lot of family problems that led to so much instability. And finally, I was at a boarding school where I could just really focus on making art.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, my teachers there really encouraged us to apply to the Scholastic Awards. And it was such a motivation boost for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I first heard about the Scholastic Awards when I was in 10th grade.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually in foster care because I had a lot of problems in my family. And my high school photography teacher really encouraged me to send in something for consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sent in a picture of a tree,
Mm-hmm.
and I ended up winning a regional award and having it be in a show. And I was so proud, and it really gave me so much inspiration and motivation to
Mm-hmm.
think that even though I couldn't always control my circumstances, I could invest in art and somebody might recognize it. So my real passion was writing.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to doing photography, I spent so much time writing novels and writing poetry and then later essays. And when I was a senior in high school, I submitted a portfolio of essays to the Scholastic Awards.
Mhm.
And I won the Gold Key Portfolio Award and got to go to Carnegie Hall. And it was one of the best weeks of my life. It was so fun. And just being taken seriously really made me take myself more seriously. Coming from the background that I was coming from, I knew I really need stability. I
Yeah.
really need to be able to get a job that will definitely have dental insurance. And so when I went to college, I studied computer science, which surprised me more than anyone. I had never even thought about studying that. And unfortunately, I didn't go to a school that had double majors. I went to a school where it was really hard to take creative writing classes. So I kind of put that part of my life on pause for 4 years.
Okay.
But when I graduated and I started working full time, 2 months later, I had started working on the manuscript that became Acceptance.
Wow. Okay. I love that journey. And I think so many teens can relate to wanting to feel secure in their job. I think so many people relate to that because it's such a scary thing to just go into a career that feels, all over the place. It doesn't have a steady path. I'm so curious to know, how did your computer science degree impact your creativity?
I think it was the perfect job for me. I
Mhm.
really do, because it used a different part of my brain than
Right.
writing used. And so I had energy to write in the morning before work and then after work. And the work-life balance and everything was really good in a way that some jobs that are more creative
Yeah,
can sometimes be really exploitative.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it also taught me so much about how to edit and how to structure stories, because so much of software is like finding the right container for the problem. And
Yeah.
then once you kind of figure out the structure, everything else falls into place.
That is fascinating. And I know nothing about computer science, but I have always kind of heard of like coding being kind of like a language. So it like is kind of creative in that sense. So even when you think like one of your other passions isn't connected to creativity, you can always find a way, which is so inspiring. So how did you go to nonfiction? How did you were talking earlier about photography and like different, how did you get to essays from there?
My high school had a really amazing nonfiction teacher, and
Oh,
everybody was like, you have to take this class. And the biggest life advice that I have for myself now, my younger self, for people listening, is to take the classes with the really good teachers. Like,
yeah.
it doesn't even matter what they're teaching. A really good teacher will change your life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's excellent advice.
Yeah. And I had a lot of stuff that was just like bottled up in me that I had never really talked about. And
Mhm.
that was what made its way onto the page in nonfiction. And that was both really, really scary and probably why I took a break for a couple years.
Okay. Yeah.
But it was also really necessary for me. And people often ask, like, is writing therapeutic?
Mhm.
And I think it's kind of bad therapy. Like, it's not that effective. But I will say, like, one of my essays for the portfolio was writing about one of my parents' gender transitions.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. So when I was 10, one of my parents came out as trans and transitioned to being a woman, and how that had impacted me.
Hmm.
And people had always told me, like, oh, you must be so traumatized, or you must be so confused. It was a different era, right?
Right.
Um, and but it really had affected me, not,
Well,
yeah, not in negative ways, but it just shaped the way that I saw myself and I saw being a girl and being a woman. And it was really the first place that I could be honest about it and that I could deal with that complexity without having other people's judgments just supersede whatever I wanted to say.
was there ever a time where you thought maybe you would take those emotions and put it into fiction, or did you just jump straight into nonfiction?
I did do fiction because I did the National Novel Writing Month.
Right.
I
Right.
think every year for 4 years. but I never read what I wrote. Like literally to this day, I have never opened up those like documents and
Yeah.
seen because I was scared. And I'm actually working on a novel now.
Oh, okay. Amazing. An adult novel.
A very adult novel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's about a throuple in 1946.
Wait, that's amazing. Okay, I'm excited for that. I will definitely be reading that.
Yeah. I I wrote it during National Novel Writing Month last year. And
And you read
so
that one though.
yeah, I finally I read it yet. I finished reading it today. Literally before I
Good.
hopped on the phone with you, I finished reading the document. I'm making the outline. But it's kind of wonderful that the process that I use for writing and editing now, it
Mhm.
is basically the same process I had when I was a teenager.
Okay, so what's that? Tell us about that.
Well, first I put down a lot of garbage on the page, like
Which
whatever
is
comes into my
why
mind.
NaNoWriMo is so great for that because it forces you to just like, you can't read anything back. You just put it all on the page. So that makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. And last year I used this editor that if you stop typing, it would delete everything you had. Yeah.
Wow. Do you know the name of that by any chance, or we'll put it in the show notes for
Put it
anybody?
in the show notes.
Okay,
But
okay.
I was so sick because I was pregnant. So now I seem like a million years old because I'm a parent myself now. But I was pregnant. I was so sick. Literally all that I could do was go for 30 minutes or 45 minutes a day and like imagine, okay, based on what I know about the 1940s, what was it like to be a bisexual woman and a couple of three people in the 1940s?
Wow.
And so now it's really fun to go back and edit that and to like so my process has been like put all the stuff on the page
Uh-huh.
and then just kind of keep rewriting it over and over
Yes.
again. And I
Yes.
think I went through 27 drafts of acceptance. But not everybody does this. Like a lot of people, they spend more time writing the first draft or they're
Mhm.
better at like outlining. And I pray that this does not take me 27 drafts. I don't think that's
I
a
hope
very
that
efficient way to do it. Yeah.
No, but I think it's really interesting that like your process as a teen is so similar to what you're doing today. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
testament to sometimes as a creative person, you just know yourself and you know yourself from a young age and what works and you stick to that, which is awesome. Um, so I'm curious because this episode is really about the publishing process
Yes.
and teens wondering, like I have this dream of being an author. How do I get there? I would love to know about your journey to actual publication and, finding your first agent and all of that.
Yeah. So I started writing acceptance knowing, okay, I definitely want to publish this, but I didn't know anything about it. And so for memoir, typically you either write the whole book
Yeah.
or you write a proposal, which is like a sales pitch for the book with some
Mhm.
sample chapters and then various businessy things. And because I didn't have a platform, I didn't have an audience that I had already built up,
Mhm.
I was like, I need to write the whole book. And so I did that during National Novel Writing Month of 2015. I wrote the first draft and then I wrapped up a second draft about 6 months later. And then I knew one person who had an agent.
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, will you send this to your agent? But she had like a lot of changes that she wanted, and I kept sending it back to her. I got feedback, but it didn't always align with my vision of it. And so that ended up taking a couple of years,
Mhm.
really a back and forth, like 3 years maybe. And then I was like, you know what? I need to start reaching out to agents on my own.
Yeah.
And so I wrote what's called a query letter, which is basically a one-page sales pitch for the book. It's like what you would read on the back cover or like the flap copy. That makes the book sound really exciting and fun. And then I ended up sending that to around 70 agents,
Hmm.
like in batches. And a number of people requested the manuscript. Nobody was taking me on. And then one person who was an assistant at an agency, she was like, okay, I really like this, but we don't represent memoir that isn't researched.
Oh,
She
okay.
was like, yeah, all the nonfiction that we represent is either like researched or reported. Do you
But not
think that you could,
personal.
well, it could be personal, but it had to include like a research component.
Okay. Oh,
And
interesting.
so she's like, do you think that you could talk about kind of the bigger picture here? And the book Acceptance, it basically follows my high school journey. It goes a little bit into college, but it's mostly about high school and navigating some of the systems that I was going through, right? Like the teen mental health system, the foster care system, homelessness in between breaks at school. And so there was stuff there, but I had never even thought about doing research. That had never occurred to me, especially because I really like reading books that are true stories
Mhm.
that read like novels.
Yeah.
And I was like, how could you possibly do that and research it? But this was really like my only option. She
Mhm.
was like the most promising person. And so I spent around a year doing research, like trying to make it fit, having it not really fit. And then I sent back my revised manuscript and I got an email from somebody else who was like, oh, Mia has already left. She no longer works at the agency. She's now an editor, an editorial assistant at Penguin Press.
Okay.
And she's like, is it okay if I forward it to her there? And so then we got coffee. This was 2018. I got coffee with her, and then she was like, okay, here's what I need to see from the revision. Like, you need to make it into more of a cohesive like narrative around one point. Less
Mhm.
of like an autobiography of like, here's your whole life and more like focused. And I also got that advice from somebody else who was friends with like a college friend. She was my
Okay.
college friend's sister. Her name is Carolyn Blakey. And she was an editor too. And she gave me the same advice. And she was basically like, I don't represent books like this, but I'm going to give you some advice.
Mhm.
And so I went and I did that. And I had a concussion in the meantime. I edited and edited and edited. I kept looking for agents. And then eventually in 2020, I had quit my job at Google and like accepted a new job offer. But in the middle, I negotiated. I was like, I need 10 months off, 10
Okay.
months before I start, because I was like, that's when I'm going to finish this book.
Hmm.
And during that time, I did get an agent, and Mia, this editor, was interested. And then in the beginning of 2021, I finally sold the book to Mia, who had like found the book in the slush
Crazy.
pile out of like thousands of manuscripts. But that was like that's the really long story. But I feel like it really was like you're going door to door and you're knocking on like every single door, right? You're going to like the
Absolutely.
side door. You're doing every single thing that you can do. And I went to like all these networking events. I signed up for every program. And I think it was all worth it and it all had to happen. It was a lot of work.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like it. I mean, even as you were speaking, I'm like, oh my gosh, you were doing this while working at Google. So
Yeah.
that is so inspiring on so many levels. And I'm thinking, like, for a teen out there who, it's comparable to being a full-time student and wanting to work on your art outside of class. Like, do you have any advice for how to balance your full-time job with your writing life? How did you keep that all straight?
It was really helpful to me to have a designated time every day and every week that I worked on the book stuff.
Okay.
And so I like people say, oh, you were working full time at Google. And I'm like, working full time at Google is much easier than being a teacher or being a nurse or a janitor, right? Um, and so I started my day at like 10 a.m.
Okay.
at Google. And so I would get up at like 7 and I would be out the door in like 5 minutes flat. I had like little bags of chicken breast to eat for breakfast that I kept in the fridge. I like made them on the weekend, meal prep girly. And then I would like eat the chicken on my way to the coffee shop. And then I would sit at a coffee shop and that's when I would do all my writing between 7 and 10 a.m. And then I eventually started taking classes in the evenings, or I would like meet up with another friend who was a writer a couple nights a week to work more from like 6 to 9. And then every weekend, I did the same thing where I would get up at like 7 and then I would work on book stuff until like 2 or 3 p.m.
How did you stay motivated? I'm sure there were moments where you were like, why am I putting in all this effort. Like, how did you keep that momentum?
Well, I did ramp up quite a bit because when I started after college, I did National Novel Writing Month. That was like 45 minutes a day because I
Okay.
had learned in high school like how to type really fast and
Yeah.
write garbage. And so it was really fast. And I just did that. I would come home from work, I would do that, and then I would eat dinner. And then like I just kept adding more and more because I found that I was able to focus for longer and longer. And it was like that itch wasn't being scratched by 45 minutes. I was like, okay, I actually need like an hour to feel like I'm fully done. Like I need longer and longer. And I think it was just so satisfying. Like there's definitely parts that I avoided, that I procrastinated. I mean, I still do. I'm human, but I I feel like once you really get into it, it's so satisfying.
Yeah, and a testament to how passionate you are about what you're writing about, which that actually brings up another question is when you're writing nonfiction, how do you know when a topic is like what you want to devote your time to? Because, some topics in nonfiction could just be an article. So how do you know that you want to expand it into a whole book?
Yeah, that's such a great question. When I was working on acceptance, I got the advice of distill this into an essay and publish the essay.
I've heard that before. Yeah.
I think it's great advice. Also, if it's enough to fill a whole book, it's probably going to be hard to do that in the space of an essay. And so I wish that she had told me, like, split this into 10 essays and
Uh-huh.
publish those 10 essays. Don't write like an essay collection necessarily. Those are a whole different beast, but just like uh, you have 10 angles, you have 20 angles, you have 100 angles. And when I'm talking to people who are trying to get published, whether like a article or a book, I do think about like we often get stuck in one way of telling the story. And we think like, okay, the story is about one thing, here's where it starts, here's where it ends. And one of the really amazing things about nonfiction publishing is it's kind of like a dance between the story that you want to tell and whatever is happening in the world at that time.
Mm.
And it's really also a collaboration usually between you and the editor. And so like I have since the book came out published a bunch of pieces that are about that period of time and that often draw a lot from this text in the book. And but what those pieces are would be totally different if this book had come out 10 years ago or even if the book came out now
Right.
because just different things are going on in the world, right? Like the best example I have of that is the college admissions
Uh-huh.
standardized tests. And
Oh,
so, yeah, so I actually loved taking the SAT and like studying for the SAT. And I think it's very
that's fun.
specific to my circumstances, right? Like, not everybody does, not everybody should, but I felt like this, like, people were almost being unfair in how mean they were to this test. And
Yeah,
so,
good
when
perspective.
school, yeah, I mean, and also the spicier your take is, the easier it is to get published, right?
That is brilliant advice for every journalist listening. I love that.
Yeah. And so it was like, okay, when the schools started requiring the SAT again, I wrote a piece about like why I love the SAT. It was called Why the SAT Changed My Life.
Mhm.
And it was published in the New York Times. I was on national television talking about it. But it was like I had started writing that piece in 2018 and it came out in 2024.
Wow. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So when talking about, having the spiciest take, how do you build up that confidence to share that? I mean, I know a lot of our teens, it's nerve-wracking to even submit a nonfiction piece to us because it's like, what if nobody has said this before? What if I get rejected? What if how do you fight those
Yeah.
voices?
Yeah, that has been a big struggle for me,
Or
especially because, yeah, there's like, there's personal essay writing, which you might read in like a literary magazine where it's more of like telling a story.
yeah.
And I love that. But what I found was that there were more opportunities to get published if a piece was like an op-ed or an opinion piece,
Mm.
which is like for what I write, that's like half personal essay and half argument. And
Right.
so it's like using your story to make a point.
Mhm.
And I I feel like it has something to do with how I was socialized as a woman and coming from places where my voice was not always heard. I really felt like, how dare I have this opinion?
Yeah.
And I had so much trouble articulating it. It really was like a years long process of learning how to shape my opinion and feel more confident in it. And then also like think about, okay, what am I qualified to talk about?
Mhm.
And like nobody is going to hire me to write a piece about the war.
Right.
Like I'm the wrong person for that. But like if a piece is about like college access, I could be a good person. Or if a piece is about working at Google, yeah, okay, I am qualified to have an opinion about what it's like to work at Google.
Yeah, so talk about qualified for a teen journalist or a teen nonfiction writer who is talk about people who feel like their voice doesn't matter a lot of the time. That is teens or people under 18 who can't vote yet or whatever. How would you inspire teens to, feel comfortable sharing their voice and sharing their opinion?
Some of my favorite op-eds are written by teenagers and by students. And the New York Times doesn't have a ton, but they have a good number of these pieces that are written by student writers. And I would really recommend reading as many of those pieces as possible because I think being a young person is actually a really powerful qualification. Because now I'm old, right? I'm a millennial, I'm a younger millennial, but still, it's like some of the people listening to this are going to be Gen Alpha. And and it's like I don't know what it's like at all to
Yeah,
be 13, 14, 15 years old today.
right.
And so people who are older like will pay you money to know what it's like to like live in your world.
Mhm.
And so I think that you absolutely should not sell yourself short. I don't think expertise is about having a degree or having something on your resume so much right now as like having a lived experience that gives you a unique perspective on a topic. And that lived experience can literally be like, I'm a high schooler and I've gone through a lot of drills for disasters that could happen. Like, this is how it's impacted my mental health.
Oh, yeah. No, there's so much that teens can tell us today that is so drastically different from, when we were growing up, even though it wasn't too long ago, but it's still drastic.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think one other thing that's provided me a lot of inspiration for op-eds specifically is reading the news
Mhm.
and reading news when you find a news story where the news applies to your life in some way, to think about, okay, what is the first person version of this news story?
Love that.
Yeah.
So I know that you have taught in MFA programs, correct? And to high schoolers, is that true? I think
Um, my work has been taught in
your
MFA
work.
programs into high schoolers.
Okay, amazing. Well, this question still applies, is what have young people taught you?
Oh, man, so much. I'm thinking right now about it was a story that I wrote. It was the SAT story.
Okay.
And for that story, I talked to people who were currently in high school and college.
Mhm.
And one of the young women who I talked to was a 17-year-old named Favor. And I had written like a first draft of the story, including something like really sad that happened to her as she was applying to college. And I came back to ask her some questions, and she was like, look, I do not want you to portray me as a victim. I am not a victim here. I go to this college on a full scholarship. Like, I'm succeeding in all these different ways. And she really advocated for myself in ways that she really advocated for herself in ways that I had not been able to, and in ways that were really inspiring to me.
Mhm.
And just to really realize, okay, when I'm talking to other people, whether they're younger than me, older than me, my age, am I flattening them? Am I projecting my own beliefs onto them? And the story ended up being so much stronger for finding ways to show favors incredible strength and really all that she had accomplished for herself.
That's a great example. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm
All
like
right.
a little emotional.
No, I am as well.
Yeah.
So important more than ever to have those voices. So
This is Hot Seat.
all right, are you ready?
Yes.
Are you most creative in the summer or the winter?
Winter.
Sweet or salty snacks for writing?
Sweet.
Your dream travel destination for writing research?
Well, I'd say New York City, but I live in New York City for writing. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. I just really want to go to Berlin. I feel like Berlin is so artsy.
What's your favorite non-writing activity that influences your creativity?
Gossiping?
Amazing. What's a topic you hope to write about someday?
Ooh.
I'm sure there are tons, but one.
Why babies and toddlers aren't learning how to share anymore.
If you had to write a book in a completely different genre, taking out what you're working on now, what would it be?
I'd say a romance novel.
For writer's block, what works best? Going on a walk or taking a shower?
Taking a shower and everything shower.
Which is harder to write, the first sentence or the last sentence?
I think the first sentence.
And our very last question is, can you tell our audience where they can find you?
Yes, I am at emineitfeld.com. My name is Emi, and my last name is N as in Nancy, I as in indigo, Etfeld. But I guess that's in the show notes. But I'm at emineitfeld.com, and I have a Substack, and I'm a little bit on social media.
Amazing. And how about you just show us your book one more time?
Yes. Okay. And Acceptance is available wherever you buy books.
Perfect. Emi, thank you so much for sharing your career with us. I feel so inspired. So I know our listeners do too. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Avery.
And that wraps up our first episode of the new season of the Scholastic Awards Podcast. Thank you so much to everyone for listening and for supporting teen artists and writers. As always, you can find our guests linked in our show notes, as well as our website, blog, and scholarship resources. If you liked what you heard today, please do us a favor and leave us a review. Send this episode to a friend who's interested in pursuing a career in art or writing and doesn't know where to begin. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn. Come say hi. So much of the beauty of art comes with connection. So let's connect and stay creative. Bye, everyone. See you next time.